all the judges ready? All right, before I begin with my constructive, I'd like to say a couple thank yous for obviously everyone who has helped make this tournament possible, the judges, everyone in TAB, and all of my competitors. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Mr. Lowry, who is the speech and debate head coach at our school, and I can say that at this tournament in particular, he has definitely been kind of like one of my cheerleaders, helping me through break rounds. Also, my LD coach, Mr. Coots, who has taught me probably everything that I know about philosophy and entertained a lot of unnecessary and obscure conversations with me. Also, Dakota McCoy, who's a relatively new PF coach at Chesterton, and even though he's supposed to be coaching PF, I can say that he's helped me just as much as Mr. Coots and Mr. Lowry. And also a special thank you to Katrina Ballin, who not only is my best friend, but I definitely would not be in this round right now if it was not for her. So, if everyone is still ready, I'll begin with my case. Supreme Court Justice William Brennan expressed the importance of speech when he said, "The nation's future depends upon leaders trained through the wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas that discovers the truth out of a multitude of tongues, rather than through any kind of authoritative selection." Because I agree with the Supreme Court and Brennan, I must affirm the resolution. Resolved. Public colleges and universities in the United States ought not restrict any constitutionally protected speech. Restrict is defined by Oxford dictionaries as to withhold information from general circulation, and constitutionally protected speech is characterized by Museum Institute. Campuses are in no way obligated to permit speech that poses a threat of imminent danger, lawlessness, or the destruction of either public or private property. What is criminal away from campus is criminal on campus. This is because universities are not islands. They're parts of larger communities of values and interests. For this reason, my value is societal welfare, which is concerned with the interests of society as a whole. Education is one of the basic definitional elements of societal welfare, and therefore the quality of education that's available in a society directly impacts the potential quality of life that's achievable in that society. The well-being of society is directly benefited by the work of universities to educate and to challenge conventions. Therefore, it's of paramount importance to consider the impact of this resolution on society. My value criterion is Kantian epistemology, which is concerned with Kant's synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. Concepts without perceptions are empty, but perceptions without concepts are blind. Kant explains that although experience is necessary for knowledge, it's not the sole source. This means that education, or the gaining of knowledge, can only come from a combination of experiences and practical understandings of those experiences. True knowledge gained by the epistemology is the only way for societies to progress. There are three main reasons for this. First, knowledgeable, enlightened societies are inherently oriented towards progress. Secondly, according to the fundamentals of macroeconomic theory, a more and better educated populace is a precursor for economic growth. This gives a society the means to provide for its people. And third, a better educated populace will be more likely to allocate those means more fairly and more efficiently. Contention 1. Restrictions undermine the purpose of higher learning. Subpoint A. Free speech promotes access to knowledge. Duke Law Journal finds that classic marketplace theory recognizes the search for truth as the primary goal of free speech. Philosopher John Stuart Mill explains that the fullest liberty of expression is required to push our arguments to their logical limits, rather than to those of social embarrassment. And he says that if this liberty of expression is stifled, then the price paid is one of intellectual pacification. When epistemology is limited, the search for truth is cut short. Societies cannot evolve without the knowledge that problems exist, and then the open discussion that helps find solutions. Subpoint B. Speech codes chill necessary discussion. Speech codes result in a stifling chilling effect that prevents the necessary dialogue for progress. Duke University of Law explains, the movement to control speech has a sinister side. The chilling effect on those who are concerned about potential punishment will surely stifle the free and robust exchange of ideas that is so critical for campus climate. Even if administrators believe they can devise a code that only limits the right amount of speech, the mere penalty will have a chilling effect. This chilling effect is an unintentional byproduct of speech codes because students and faculty alike will fear punishment and therefore be less likely to discuss the controversial ideas that demand our attention the most. It also prevents individuals who actually believe in these hateful or prejudiced ideas from receiving the criticisms that will help change their mind. If we cannot identify bigoted ideas, then we can do nothing to change them. Subpoint C, restrictions damage the educational atmosphere. This is done in two ways. First, speech codes only exacerbate tensions and contribute to polarization on campus. According to Southern California Law Review, dominant groups on campuses will likely see speech codes as unnecessary in responding to issues that don't affect them. This will increase animosity and rivalry between the groups, so any benefits to the minorities will be short-lived and outweighed by the sacrifices made to the overall educational environment. Codes won't enforce civility, they'll just drive discriminatory beliefs underground where they will fester and potentially explode later in more violent forms. Speech codes also fail to recognize and address the root cause behind this abusive speech, which is actually intolerance, ignorance, and bigotry. This means that speech codes on universities are just as effective as fighting a fire by only spraying the tips of the flames while still allowing the house to continue to burn. You may reduce the size of the fire, but you'll never put it out. Secondly, restrictions ill-prepare students for life after college. The best response to more negative speech is more speech, not less. The purpose of public universities is to challenge students' opinions and to broaden their horizons, not to shrink them. Geoffrey Stone of the Inquirer explains that although racist, sexist, homophobic, and otherwise offensive messages are certainly repellent, the only way that colleges and universities can prepare their students to be effective citizens in the real world is not by shielding them from such ugliness, but instead by empowering them to respond to that speech with courage, dignity, and reason. If our institutions of higher learning fail to meet this basic responsibility, then they will, over the long run, undermine the very foundations of higher education and democratic decision-making. For all these reasons, I strongly urge a vote in affirmation and now stand open for cross-ex.
Right, Judge, ready? We're ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, let's move. You talk about this search for truth. What is this search for truth?
The search for truth in this context is primarily done through higher education.
So it's learning.
Sure.
Okay, so your goal is education.
Not just education, but specifically education that results in the true gaining of actual knowledge. Not false knowledge that is a result of echo chambers, but actual knowledge that comes from experiential learning and understanding of those experiences.
Actual knowledge needs experience, and the rest is just fake knowledge?
No, what Kant is saying here is that the only way that someone can get true knowledge is from one of two ways: from discussions about experiences or through those experiences directly. But it's most effectively done when you have both.
Okay, through experiences and through discussion.
Yes.
Cool. Your first contention, you talk about this chilling effect and exhausting of ideas and access to knowledge.
Yes.
Okay, give me a favor. Where are we restricting in today's resolution?
We're restricting specifically constitutionally protected speech on college campuses.
On college campuses.
Yes.
What is the purpose of a university?
A university is designed to prepare students for life after college and to give them practical and realistic knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you only have one contention, correct?
Yes.
Okay, what was your last subpoint?
My last subpoint was that restrictions damage the educational atmosphere.
Okay, how do they damage the educational atmosphere?
Well, I outlined two specific reasons. First, they only exacerbate tensions on campus and contribute to fuller polarization between the groups.
How does that, where's the link there?
Well, there's a couple of them. In my speech, I first talked about the idea that dominant groups on campus aren't going to see the speech codes as necessary. They're seeing them as frivolous because they don't have experience.
So they're just going to ignore them because they don't feel like doing them.
They're going to think that the codes aren't as necessary as the groups that are actually demanding them.
Okay, so they're not going to follow the speech codes, you're saying?
Also, the codes aren't going to enforce civility.
Okay, so they're not going to be following the speech codes?
No.
These people, so they are going to follow the speech codes?
They aren't going to necessarily follow the speech codes. It would be the same as any other law. There's always going to be people that break it.
But in general, most people will follow, right?
Perhaps, if you can establish that.
Perhaps. Okay. Okay, how do codes permit discriminatory beliefs? Speech codes.
Discriminatory beliefs?
Yeah, discriminatory beliefs, discretionary beliefs.
Even if speech codes are completely effective at stopping the speech, they're not stopping the ideas behind that speech.
What are those problems?
Like I outlined in my last constructive, ignorance, intolerance, and bigotry.
Okay, so we need to solve those problems. It has to be on college campuses.
Well, idealistically, we should solve them overall, but this resolution is specifically referring to college campuses.
Okay, so we need to solve it on college campuses. Okay, go ahead and repeat what's your criterion today.
Kantian epistemology.
Okay, it's defined as practical experience with real life experience, correct?
To an extent, yes.
Okay. And how does that achieve societal welfare?
Well, for the three reasons that I outlined, first, when you have an enlightened society, it's inherently oriented towards progress. And then the other two reasons that I provided in my initial speech.
All right, thank you. I'm going to take rolling prep time.
But first, I'm going to give some thank yous. My coach told me to keep it brief, so I'm going to try to. I'm going to start with, obviously, my debate family over there. They've helped me in just about everything I've done. I couldn't have done it without them. My normal family helping me out, my brother, my mom, they're really supportive in this. I mean, I'm out every Saturday. I mean, that's got to be pretty annoying. So that's really helpful. I'd like to thank the LD squad specifically for helping me get evidence and help me with this journey. It's just really been so helpful. Suhas, Durnal, Jutton, Senghal, and Bowen Jing. They've just been really great. And lastly, I'd like to thank my coach, my father, Mr. Smith, Aaron Smith. He's just been really great over all these years of debate. I originally didn't even want to do debate. He coached me into it, I guess you could say. And now I'm doing it, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm happy to be up here. So thank you to all of them, and now let's move on to different stuff. Judges ready? All ready? All right, then let's begin. What should move us into action is human dignity. The inalienable dignity of the oppressed, but also the dignity within each of us. We lose our dignity if we tolerate the intolerable. Because I agree with Dominique Demneil, I negate the resolution resolved. Public colleges and universities in the United States ought not restrict any constitutionally protected speech. I'd like to provide a couple of definitions for clarity, the first of which is going to be ought, defined as a moral obligation, followed by constitutionally protected speech, which according to Frederick Scherer. Alluringly uncomplicated is the proposition that the words of the Constitution, such as speech, can and should be interpreted as ordinary language, having substantially the same meaning in constitutional text as they do in everyday discourse. Perjury is speech, conspiracy is speech, oral and written fraud is speech, verbally describing military secrets to an enemy is speech, and calling a bookie to place a bet is speech. Yet none of these activities have been held to be within the scope of the First Amendment, therefore we will not treat them as such. Simply put, there's speech, and there's constitutionally protected speech. I'll now move on to my value today, the thing we must prize highest in today's round, which is going to be morality, defined by Oxford as principles concerned with the distinction between right and wrong and good and bad behavior. Now, when looking at all possible solutions, we must ask ourselves, what solution achieves morality? Today, we'll be using morality in the context of my criterion, the thing required to uphold my value, which in today's round is going to be moral consequentialism. Defined by the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy as, of all things a person might do at any given moment, the morally right action is the one that yields the best overall consequences. In essence, this provides a weighing mechanism in which we will determine morality. I will have one brief observation in today's debate, and that will be regarding the word any in the resolution. The resolution tells us that we must not restrict any constitutionally protected speech. So if the negative today, or me, can prove that there's even one place that we must restrict, then I've effectively won today's round. With this in mind, I'm going to move on to the first contention today, which is we ought to eliminate hate speech. I'll have two subpoints to support this, the first of which is subpoint A, hate speech is morally wrong. Now, in doing something as simple as saying a hateful slur or a racist remark, it turns out that we have violated the moral course of action, and T.J. Donahue explains that one of the precepts of all moral codes is racism is wrong. To commit a racist act means that one has violated the moral obligation. Now, what makes racism wrong is A, that it violates moral norms of equal respect, and B, that it's integrally tied to race-based systems of oppression. Above all, what makes racism wrong is simply and solely that it entails omitting treating every person as a bearer of equal dignity. In any action we take, we must learn to make the moral decision. And because we all have that fundamental instinct to know that hate speech is wrong, there is no doubt today that we should limit it on college campuses and universities. Now, because hate speech chips away at human dignity and violates treating every person with a moral worth, we must negate. However, hate speech isn't just morally wrong, which brings me to my subpoint B today, which is that hate speech harms. So we know hate speech allows for a moral injustice, but it seems that there are many more problems that come with the use of hate speech. According to a paper from the University of Massachusetts titled Deconstructing Hate Speech in the DRC by Joanna Volhart from 2007, throughout all historical cases, structures and dynamics of hate speech are, in principle, comparable and therefore universal. Less visible but very harmful effects such as intense psychological distress among targeted groups can occur, even predicting increased suicide rates among targets of its victims. So by allowing for the continued use of hate speech, we're not only allowing for the degrading of people which causes psychological distress, but we also allow for the increase in suicides. Hearing these effects, there's no other option than negating today. I'll now move on to my opponent's case, and I'm going to start with her value of societal welfare. While I agree that societal welfare is an important thing, we need to look to the moral action today and answer the moral obligation we were asked in today's resolution. We have to see that I achieve the societal welfare also by promoting people and not having them to deal with hate speech. Moving on to my opponent's criterion, it's a Kantian epistemology, essentially talking about we need to look at experiences and real-world applications of it. But we have to realize that hate speech falls into both of these categories and therefore is relevant to today's discussion. We need to realize that hate speech, people understand the harms of hate speech, and many people have had it happen to them. And then it's also a textbook definition of it. There's many things that happen with hate speech. It definitely falls under Kantian epistemology. I achieve hers too. I'll now move on to the contention level, and I'm going to start with her first, in her own way, I guess. Her subpoint A talks about this idea of access for knowledge, or the search for truth, as she puts it. Now, what my opponent doesn't realize, or at least doesn't say, is that there's multiple ways to search for truth. I'll have two responses, the first of which is the search for truth can happen outside of public colleges and universities. It's not unique to the public college and university to promote societal change. Look to the many examples that have happened over the years. Look to Martin Luther King. He was sitting in a jail in Birmingham when he wrote a letter that changed the course of history. That alteration changed what we now think of today, and it started the civil rights movement. That did not necessarily have to happen on a college campus and university. So to stop this hate speech and still achieve what my opponent wants to, we must negate. However, my second response is, if we want to have this access to knowledge, we also want more ideas, which ties to her subpoint B. She talks about this idea of chilling discussion. Essentially, more people are not going to talk, and we need more ideas present. But we have to see more ideas are going to be present on the negative side, because hate speech has a silencing effect. Now, according to Suzanne Bryson from the University of Chicago in her paper, The Autonomy Defense Principle of Free Speech, hate speech has the silencing effect of bystanders, or at least preventing others from listening to what I have to say. Then audiences are being deprived of their speech. If restrictions on hate speech could help to prevent this silencing effect, there would be additional audience interest in having such restrictions. Essentially, this says when people are having hate speech spoken at them, they're less likely to share their ideas. After all, repercussions may come with it. So if my opponent wants to really provide societal change, we need all ideas to be present, as my opponent hopes to gain, but cannot on the affirmative position. We need more ideas on the negative position. Moving on to her subpoint C, I don't think she qualified, she changed it to a subpoint C, but it's its own idea, so I'm going to treat it as such. She talks about damaging the atmosphere. What we have to realize is most people will indeed follow the laws. She even said in cross-examination that perhaps most people will follow the laws, but we have to say that's true. And if you don't, you're going to get punished. According to Cagle-Juhan in his article, Free Speech, Hate Speech in the Hostile Speech Environment from the Virginia Law Review on November 2012, and a student who has just spoken hate speech even with the speech codes, in sum, there's strong incentive for the university to regulate his bad and offensive speech, and for the student to do nothing about it. So in essence, we have to see people will follow these speech codes because the repercussions that come to them will make them want to. So looking over today's round, we have to see that the negative achieves all the things the affirmative wants to, including getting rid of this chilling effect and allowing for more people to share their opinions, which leads to a better society overall. Thank you. I now stand open for cross-examination.
Are the judges ready? Opponent ready?
Yep.
All right, let's begin. So let's start with your value of morality. So how do we decide whether or not something is right or wrong?
Well, that's where you look to the criterion today. I talked about moral consequentialism. Essentially, we looked at the results of the actions and then compare it to determine the moral result.
Okay, so whichever side can yield the best results, per se, will win this round.
I specified the moral results, so my subpoint A technically counts as a consequence.
But aren't the moral results just the consequences?
Well, we look at yes, but I have a moral consequence in my subpoint A. It talks about how hate speech is fundamentally wrong. Therefore, it's still a consequence.
Okay. So let's just go straight to that subpoint A. So you say that hate speech is fundamentally wrong. Can you elaborate on your reasoning for this a little bit?
It's fun. Oh, I have the card that says so, but essentially, we all have the fundamental intuition. Now, I'm not promoting fundamental intuition as a way to look at it's not a weighing mechanism, but I'm simply saying that that's one of the impacts.
Okay, so hate speech is wrong because of what?
Well, it just violates It violates, it's inherently morally wrong.
Why is it inherently morally wrong?
Because society has deemed it morally wrong.
So whatever society says is moral is what we should do?
Well, morality
If
is,
society says that racism is moral,
if society says racism is moral,
that's what society has deemed as moral, and that's what then you're advocating for under that idea.
society has not deemed racism as moral. It deems racism as immoral.
Okay. So let's talk specifically about this subpoint a little bit more. So just because something is or isn't morally wrong, does that mean that we should restrict it?
Well, I'm simply saying that because it's morally wrong, that is one reason, yes.
Okay.
Not by
So-
itself, but it is one reason.
Take the example of cheating on your spouse. This is morally wrong, and it results in emotional harms to the person being cheated on. Why don't we restrict this?
Well, I guess that in the United States at least, we regard that as a privacy matter, so we just don't get into that.
Okay, well, wouldn't my private exchanges of dialogue with someone else then also be a private matter?
But we have to see that hate speech causes harms that doesn't to more groups of people.
You're saying that cheating on your spouse doesn't have the same, if not more, emotional harms than hate speech?
I'm saying that overall, if we look at the impact of more people, we have to see that hate speech harms more people in general.
Okay, so whatever issues face the most people is what we should address?
I'm simply saying that because it's morally wrong, that's what we need to look to.
All right. So how do we determine, looking at your subpoint B, what causes these harms? What causes the psychological stress?
Well, psychological stress is just coming from hate speech. It's just as simple as that.
Okay, so if speech is hateful, it will have psychological effects?
That's what I'm saying.
So is this based off of offense?
Can you specify?
If I offend someone, is that what causes these psychological effects?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you're talking about, but if someone uses hate speech on a person, then they will gain these psychological
All right, and
effects.
then what was your source for that psychological stress?
University of Massachusetts, Deconstructing Hate Speech in the DRC.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Have an answer.
Thank you.
All right, all the judges ready? Opponent ready?
Yep.
I'm going to begin by addressing my opponent's case, and then I'll move on to address my own. Starting with the value structure as a whole, what we have to recognize here is that there's a fundamental contradiction in my opponent's value structure. He just uses circular logic to determine what is moral. He's saying to look at, to find morality, we have to assess the consequences, and then the consequences define what is moral. So he never really establishes any kind of standard for morality. So when we then look over at the affirmative value structure of societal welfare, using my opponent's value criterion of consequentialism, what we have to recognize here is that the only way that we're going to yield any kind of benefit in today's round is if we look at the consequences of what restrictions will do. And we have to look at these consequences and how they will impact society as a whole. And we can see that because Kantian epistemology promotes knowledge for those three key reasons that I've already outlined, that is the best way for us to yield any kind of benefit to society as a whole and specifically to college campuses. Moving on to address my opponent's observation, he says that any example of an example where hate speech should be restricted should yield a negative ballot. However, what we have to recognize here is that we have to instead prefer what is going to provide the most benefit for society. Looking at my opponent's first contention, he says that hate speech is morally wrong, and he doesn't ever define what morally wrong is, so this argument is a little bit arbitrary. But what we can recognize here is that just because something is morally wrong doesn't mean that it needs to be restricted. Going back to that example from cross-examination, cheating on your spouse is morally wrong, and it has severe psychological implications on the victim. But it's not restricted in the status quo, because just because something is morally wrong, there's a difference between what is moral and what is illegal, and this is a distinction that ought to remain that way. Plus, the fundamental idea behind this subpoint undermines his value structure because it doesn't analyze the consequences on society. It's talking about a deontological idea. Moving on to address his second subpoint, he says that hate speech harms. And I'm going to have three responses to this. First, we have to recognize that restrictions are more harmful to society on balance than any one simple example of hate speech could be. Secondly, moving on to address these ideas of psychological studies and increased suicide rates. What harms someone and what causes offense and what causes the psychological damage is extremely subjective. What causes the psychological harm to one person will not be the same to the next person, so therefore it's impossible to create a policy to restrict this if we don't even know what we're supposed to be restricting. Also, we have to recognize that although the negative brings up all of these issues with the status quo, he never once provides any way that says that restrictions on hate speech will solve these problems. And this is a direct result of the fact that there is no legal definition of hate speech that's accepted by our justice system, and that is why restrictions will be overly vague and overly broad and not yield any significant benefit to society. Moving on to address my own case, looking specifically at my first contention, he says that the search for truth can happen outside universities. The issue here is that the search for knowledge is supposed to be the fundamental goal of universities. So then why are we going to have universities if the fundamental goal is supposed to happen somewhere else? Looking specifically at ACLU, they said that although racist, sexist, and homophobic speech is concerning, the best response to this speech is more, not less, because at universities, we facilitate learning through open debate and study. This is the fundamental idea here. The only way we're going to gain knowledge is through open discourse. Specifically looking at my second subpoint, he says that there's more ideas present on the negative side, and this is because of the silencing effect. But because restrictions don't solve the problem, because restrictions don't solve the silencing effect, we still have less discourse on the negative side. We just also have these harmful regulations that chill discussion and polarize the campus climate. Moving on to look at my subpoint C, his only response to this is that most people follow the laws. Even if this is true, we don't know what most people is. Most people could just be 51% of people. That's a majority. What we have to recognize here is this is just an extension of the fact that there is no way that the negative can solve for the problems he brings up. So for these reasons, I urge a vote on the affirmative.
Judges ready? Opponent ready? All right, then let's begin. So I'm going to start with my opponent's attack on my value of morality. She claims that it's a contradiction and that it's a circular logic. However, I'd like to say that that's not circular logic at all. I'm saying we can look at the consequences of an action to determine if determine if it's the moral action we need to take. That's what I'm saying. That's not circular logic. I'm going to move on. My opponent responded to my first contention simply saying, well, what's morally wrong? And if it's morally wrong, why do we even care? Because we're not going to be applying it into the real world. First off, I would like to say that the resolution says we should decide what we ought to do in today's resolution. Not that we're going to be actually applying it. So we actually need to look at what the moral obligation says, and that falls to the negative position, the value of morality. Because we're not actually applying it, we're just looking at it. My opponent then says it violates consequentialism somehow because it's a deontological argument. But what I'm saying, the inherent immorality of it is a consequence on its own, and therefore it definitely needs to be considered. Now, moving forward to my opponent's subpoint A, or my subpoint B, my opponent responds with three things. She says the first, it's more harmful. However, she provides no mechanism to show why it's more harmful. She just makes the claim, it's more harmful, and then moves on to the next response. Her next response is that it's subjective, and the same next response is that we don't know how we're going to solve it. However, I would like to provide one response. If you want to not make it subjective, there's a simple way, and that's looking at what hate speech really is. Now, my opponent is using Kantian epistemology, so to please my opponent, we can uphold hers on the negative side. After all, if we want to look to real-world experiences and textbook definitions, that's exactly what we'll do to make sure hate speech isn't vague at all. We can take a definition of hate speech, such from Merriam-Webster, which is speech intended to insult, offend, or intimidate a person because of some trait, such as race, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, or disability, and then you combine that with what victims of hate speech say to create a functioning version that only allows targeted hate speech to be covered and all targeted hate speech to be covered. So yes, we can make a perfect combination of subjectivity and objectivity using my opponent's framework into my own, and I absorb hers. Now, the second thing we have to realize is my opponent kind of dismisses it, simply saying with those attacks that we won't know what it is. So we have to look at my subpoint B saying the harms still exist. And to further those harms, we have to see that the emotional consequences, the psychological distress that my opponent just kind of blows off are actually very important. In fact, this Telegraph article expands. In their paper, When Hurt Will Not Heal, Exploring the Capacity to Relieve Social and Physical Pain, the authors propose that recent discoveries suggesting social or emotional pain is as real and as intense as physical pain. Participants in the emotional pain condition reported higher levels of pain than the participants in the physical pain condition. Found the researchers at Purdue University in the United States and Macquarie University in the University of South Wales in Australia. So in essence, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words actually hurt even more. Now I'm going to move on to my opponent's side of the flow. She starts with her first contention. She talks about the access to knowledge. And she says, well, that's the point of universities. They are the places where we look at knowledge. But my opponent's confusing what definition of knowledge is in this case. There's two different types of knowledge. There's book knowledge, which is the type we're supposed to be looking at in universities. And then there's social knowledge, or societal knowledge. And that's what we can look at in the university and everywhere else. That's not unique to a college campus and university. That's what I'm talking about. Well, book knowledge may be unique to a university. That's not what any of us are talking about today. We're talking about social knowledge, and that can be applied everywhere. So therefore, she didn't directly respond to that. So therefore, all the things she talks about in her first contingent apply to the negative side as well, so I reap those benefits. Moving on, my opponent claimed again that restrictions don't work. However, maybe she didn't hear me, but I read in my last speech a card that said, essentially, the restrictions will work, because when people realize the restrictions that are put up, and they realize that they're going to get punished if they don't, they're going to follow these restrictions. My opponent provided no counter evidence to go against this. She simply says logic that we probably won't solve. So we cannot look to that. We have to look to actual evidence that I've provided that says otherwise. Now, again, my opponent says we don't know what most people is for that argumentation. However, like I said, I have a card that shows that it will be solved. My opponent has provided nothing. I'll be happy to hear it, but we have to see, because she didn't provide anything, and this is my last speech, we cannot look to that in the future. I'm now going to move on to voting issues, or why I believe the negative has won today's debate. And the first I'm going to start with is the whole value clash. My opponent's value today is societal welfare. We need to see that on the negative position, I'm achieving societal welfare by stopping hate speech while still continuing the education process. See, because we can allow for a better educational system by having people not have to listen to the hate speech. We can promote more voices, which achieves what my opponent hopes to do, while still gaining more in the end. Because I achieve societal welfare through what my opponent wants to talk about, experience by the definition of hate speech, through the definition of hate speech, I can use Kantian epistemology through experience and textbook definitions. I'm incorporating hers into mine, using it to uphold the biggest value today, which is going to be morality, called for in the resolution and called for by me. My criterion today of moral consequentials is indeed what we need to be looking for, because it takes the consequences of all action to determine what's the moral consequence, to determine what the moral objective is. In this case, even though it's inherent harm, and it's not, even though it's deontological, the inherent harm that comes with the use of hate speech and racial slurs is enough. Moving forward, I'm going to go to my second voting issue, which is this whole idea of solvency that my opponent talks about. I'd like to point out that the affirmative position never showed one reason why we should affirm, just showed a bunch of reasons why we should negate. This is very important to today's resolution, as I responded to the reasons why we should negate, leaving my opponent's case sitting open without any actual impacts. She claims that chilling discussion, and she claims that damaging the atmosphere, but because my opponent provides no real evidence to go against the claims I've provided, and I've provided multiple evidence to further what I've talked about, we have to see that the only clear way today is the negative ballot. Now, the last voting issue I'm going to give today is overall look at today's round. Because if we look to her first contention, she talks about the idea of more speech is better. We have to see that if you want more speech, you must look to the negative. Again, the chilling effect that comes with speech, the silencing effect, it's gotten rid of on the negative position, allowing for more voices, which not only promotes societal change, but a better learning environment. Essentially, I get book knowledge and societal knowledge, while the negative can achieve neither, or the affirmative can achieve neither in these cases. Thank you.
All right, so during this speech, I'm just going to go over a couple key voting issues for today's round. So I'd like to start by addressing the value structure. So my opponent's value structure, as I talked about in my last speech, is contradictory because it relies on circular logic. And his only defense for this is repeating his previous logic and then saying it's not circular logic. But what we have to realize here is that he never actually establishes what is right and what is wrong. So that's why we have no basis of determining what is moral and what's not. He just says we determine this based off of the consequences and whether or not those consequences are moral, which is circular logic. So what we should do here is evaluate the consequences because I think that's what my opponent wants us to do. He also brings up this idea of obligation and how this stems from the word ought. So he talks about how we don't have to address implementation and we don't have to discuss what will actually happen if we implement these policies. However, we ought not do something if the implementation of it is going to be more harmful than good. That doesn't make any sense. We can't live in this idealistic world of saying, well, it's a good idea, so let's do it. We have to look at what's actually going to happen. That's the entire premise behind consequentialism, is evaluating the consequences. So we have to look at those consequences and what they are. When we look at the negative world, what we see is we see further polarized campuses and we see students who are ill-prepared for life after colleges. These are 2 points in my subpoint C that my opponent never addresses in this case. And this is extremely important because if campus climate, negative campus climate, and polarization harms minorities and it contributes to these negative psychological effects that he's talking about, then they're only going to be amplified on his side of the debate. On the negative side, we can also see that there's no real solvency. The only solvency that he provides is this piece of evidence that says basically that people follow laws. But this isn't entirely the case. Even if most people follow the laws, those are probably going to be the same types of people that wouldn't be using racial slurs in the first place. So this Even if some people follow laws, there's always going to be exceptions. There's no way that the negative can remove this solvency. We also have to address the fundamental purpose of universities. He says in his last speech that what universities ought to do is to provide book knowledge. But this is the basic problem here. If all we have is book knowledge, this is the definition of being ill-prepared for the real world. Knowing 5 reasons why World War I started isn't going to help you solve a problem in the workplace. This is why we need experience-based and discussion-based learning. Look to that UCLA evidence that I pulled through in my last speech. Finally, we have to talk about the subjectivity of hate speech. Because even in his definition, hate speech is defined by offense. We have no way of determining what will and won't offend a person before we say it. This means that universities are then going to be regulating what they think will and won't offend, which is the definition of subjectivity. This is bad, and it contradicts my opponent's idea that morality is determined on an objective basis. So this results in overly vague and broad policies that ultimately end up in universities deciding what speech is valuable and what speech isn't. He also talks about this idea of the silencing effect, but once again, he doesn't solve for this, so the only way to have discourse is on the affirmative.